Hello, everyone. This is a brief overview of Chapter 3, and I hope you find Chapter 3 interesting because I find the study of culture very, very interesting. As I travel around the world, one of the things that I really like to do is to try to understand the culture that I'm visiting. I try to not just be a tourist, but to really, truly try to talk to the people who live in a country to try to gain an understanding of what their lives are like and to gain an understanding of their culture. Culture, you could think of it as a design for living, like a blueprint. If you know what a blueprint is, it's something that an architect draws. It's a design, really, for a building. And then a contractor will take that design and erect the building according to the architect's design. Well, culture is like that design for us. It tells us how to live in a particular culture. And so while this chapter really is very much focused on American culture, I hope that you may have some opportunity to think about other cultures, particularly if you are somebody who is an ethnic individual, and you think about how you live in a bicultural world wherein you live in your ethnic world, perhaps when you're at home or when you're with family members, but then you live in the dominant group world as well. Um, so again, thinking about functionalist perspective, functionalist theorists would look at culture and make the argument that culture is an important need. It serves important needs for humans. And one of the things that they point to are cultural universals. Cultural universals are things that you can find in any society. Every society known to humans has these things such as literature or the spoken word in a culture that doesn't have written language, food, um, music, dance, art, all of those things are part of culture. Now, if you think about it, dance and music and art and literature, we don't really need those things to survive. We could survive without them. Having said that, life would be kind of boring without these things. I don't know about the rest of you, but I really love music. And I love going to theater, live theater performances, to plays. And so without these things, without reading literature, life would be kind of boring for me. I don't play video games, so I'm kind of old school that way. It would be boring for me. And so I certainly agree with the idea that those cultural universals of things such as dance and literature and art and music really do add to our enjoyment of life. They entertain us, but they also bring us together over a shared love of music, say, or a shared love of art. They also distinguish us. As I said, every group has its own unique culture, and so every group has its own unique art and dance and literature and music, etc. Which means then that we bind together with others from our culture, but we also recognize that we are differentiated from others by our culture. And so that therein is the functionalist idea about how important culture is for us. Um, when you think about the conflict perspective, conflict theorists would largely argue that culture tends to serve the interests of the rich and the powerful. How does it do that? Well, as you'll learn about norms in this chapter, norms are socially shared ideas about right and wrong. Well, conflict theorists would argue that it's generally the people with the wealth and the resources who get to decide what the norms are going to be. And they typically decide that the way they act, the way they dress, the way they speak, etc., the things that they do are to be the acceptable norm, and everything else is not. And so, if you're somebody who doesn't quite fit into mainstream culture, you may find yourself being marginalized. And so, when you're marginalized, you may find it more and more difficult to become fully integrated into society. So, for conflict theorists, culture may actually serve to marginalize some people and advantage others simply because they're practicing different cultures. Um, for symbolic interactionist theorists, they're really interested in how culture guides or influences the way that we interact with one another. In the United States, two business people might shake hands. Two younger millennials might do a fist bump. But in Japan, people typically bow to one another. Years ago, 12 now, I was in Laos, a country in Southeast Asia, and the typical greeting was to put your hands together and slightly bow and say Sabaidi as you look down humbly. And so those are just examples of how culture influences or guides the way that we interact with one another. So I hope that you enjoy this chapter. It's one of my favorites simply because I'm really fascinated by culture and how people live their lives differently. So I will see you next week for the overview of the other chapters. The next chapter is coming up.